What just happened in the skies over the Middle East is not another escalation, not another war headline. It is the shot that could ignite the most dangerous nuclear powder keg on the planet. Yemen, that country the entire world wrote off as a ruined nation devastated by famine and embargo, just launched ballistic and hypersonic missiles directly at Dimona. And if that name means nothing to you yet, get ready. Because in the next few minutes, I am going to explain to you why that specific attack against that specific target could be the beginning of the end of the security architecture that the United States and Israel spent decades building across the Middle East. Welcome to Professor Jian Wei Explains. I am your host, and what you are about to hear today, you will not find this clearly laid out anywhere else. Let us start with the facts, because the facts alone are already devastating enough. This Saturday, March 28th, the armed forces of Yemen, the same forces that Western propaganda has spent years presenting as primitive militias with homemade rockets, launched ballistic missiles against what they described as sensitive military targets in southern occupied Palestine. The military spokesman of the group issued a statement from Sana'a and was absolutely categorical. This is the first operation of a campaign that will not end until attacks against the fronts of the resistance cease. First operation. That means what we saw today is not the climax. It is the opening act. And now I am going to tell you what the Western media is burying under vague headlines, because it makes them uncomfortable to say it clearly. The target of that attack was Dimona. Dimona, the Israeli nuclear reactor where Israel, in the most open secret in the international community, enriches uranium, manufactures nuclear warheads, and maintains an arsenal that no international agency has ever been allowed to inspect, because Israel never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. While the world spends decades debating whether Iran is developing nuclear capability and designs sanctions to stop it, there is a country that has between 80 and 400 operational nuclear warheads, with the tacit backing of Washington, with the active protection of the CIA, and nobody, absolutely nobody in the Western press, calls it a threat. But Yemen calls it a threat. And today Yemen pointed directly at it. Pay close attention to what I am telling you. This is the second time in less than a week that we have seen attacks directed toward Dimona. The second time. That is not coincidence. That is strategy. That is a coded message that says with complete clarity, we know where your nuclear heart is, and we have the capability to reach it. That message should run cold through the veins of security analysts in Tel Aviv, in Washington, and in every Western capital that spent years pretending Israel's undeclared nuclear arsenal did not exist. Because there is something that Dimona also protected with total discretion, and which today was exposed within the range of missiles that nobody believed Yemen would ever possess. But wait, before I tell you what makes these missiles so different from everything we have seen before, you need to understand the complete context of why Yemen decides to act exactly today, exactly this week, exactly against these targets. Because there is a chain of events that Western media presents as separate episodes, but which in reality form a single narrative, a narrative of total war already unfolding across 5 simultaneous fronts and threatening to expand to 7. On February 28, 2026, a joint American-Israeli operation eliminated Iran's supreme leader. The geopolitical impact of that event was seismic. What came afterward was not the collapse of the system that analysts in Washington had anticipated for so long. What came was exactly the opposite. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, the most ideologically hardened and most aggressive military apparatus in the Persian system, assumed de facto operational control while the new leadership structure consolidated under Mojtaba Khamenei. And here is what no Western analyst wants to admit out loud. The IRGC, under extreme pressure, does not moderate its actions. It radicalizes them. When the IRGC perceives that the existence of the project it has defended for decades faces an existential threat, it does not negotiate, it does not yield, it does not retreat. It acts with all accumulated force, with all assets deployed, with all fronts activated simultaneously. And that is exactly what we are watching right now. On March 24th, the Israeli General Staff confirmed direct air operations against defense installations on the outskirts of Tehran and against IRGC positions in Isfahan. This was not a surgical strike or a symbolic message. It was a sustained attack that hit high-priority Iranian defense infrastructure. The response came quickly. Between March 25th and 27th, Hezbollah and Lebanon intensified its launches toward northern Israel with at least 14 recorded attacks using drones and rockets. The axis was already in motion, and on March 23rd and 24th, Yemen had officially announced it was entering the war directly, not as a peripheral actor, but as an active combat front. Then silence. For days of silence that people mistook for inaction. But that silence was not passivity. It was preparation. It was the calm of the missile before launch. Today, March 28th, Yemen spoke, and it spoke in the only language hypersonic missiles know how to use. Before I continue, I need you to reflect on this, because what I am about to tell you completely changes the world's perception of Yemen and the balance of power in this war. How is it possible that a country that has spent more than a decade submerged in a devastating civil war, subjected to one of the most brutal economic blockades in recent history, with poverty and famine indices that shake the world, has developed hypersonic capability that not even Israel or the United States has fully operational? That question has an answer that Western capitals do not want to formulate out loud because the answer points directly at Moscow. Russia transferred hypersonic technology to Iran. Iran deployed it strategically in Yemen. And now from Sana'a, in a straight line to Dimona, Yemen can launch missiles that travel at speeds greater than 5 times the speed of sound, that perform evasive maneuvers upon atmospheric reentry that conventional anti-missile defense systems have enormous difficulty intercepting. The Iron Dome that protects Israel was designed to intercept short-range rockets. The Arrow system was designed for conventional ballistic missiles. But hypersonics are a different category entirely. They introduce an operational uncertainty that no Israeli general wants to discuss publicly. And there, in that uncertainty, is exactly where Yemen is striking, not only physically but psychologically. Modern war is not won solely by destroying targets. It is won by destroying the adversary's sense of invulnerability. And that is what these missiles are doing with millimeter precision in the psyche of Tel Aviv. But there is something more, something I want you to hear carefully because I have not seen any analyst frame it this way yet. This attack on Dimona is not merely a message about military capability. It is a message about intelligence. To target Dimona, Yemen needs precision coordinates, updated positioning data on defense systems, vulnerability windows in Israeli interception systems. Where does that information come from? The answer is a constellation that includes the Iranian IRGC, Russian intelligence networks, and decades of satellite monitoring of Israeli installations. Today's attack reveals that the axis of resistance possesses a level of intelligence capability regarding Israeli targets that would exceed every public assessment from Western analytical agencies. That is the most disturbing data point of the day, and it has not appeared in a single headline yet. Now the complete panorama of active fronts, because this is no longer a bilateral conflict. We are facing a 5-front regional war activating simultaneously, threatening to expand to 7. First front, Yemen. Ballistic and hypersonic missiles from Sana'a with demonstrated capability to reach the heart of Israeli military infrastructure. Geographic distance is no longer a shield. Second front, Iran. The IRGC, operating under the new leadership structure with Mojtaba Khamenei consolidating his position at the head of the system, maintaining selective attacks on Israeli targets and coordinating the complete axis. Third front, Lebanon. Hezbollah demonstrated between March 25th and 27th that it is prepared to sustain a cadence of attacks that keeps northern Israel permanently under pressure. 14 registered attacks in just 3 days. Fourth front, Iraq. Axis factions with presence in Iraqi territory were explicitly named in the Yemeni communique as part of the fronts to be defended. Their projection capability toward Israel is real and was demonstrated in previous operations. Fifth front, and here comes what Professor Jian Wei Explains has been anticipating for weeks: Syria. The presence of Axis-linked forces in Syrian territory, combined with the escalation dynamic we are witnessing, positions Syria as the next front that could activate in a direct and sustained manner. 5 active fronts, 2 more potential. The geometry of this conflict has no precedent in the post-World War II period, and the world is still processing the magnitude of what is occurring. Netanyahu, the implacable strategist, the man who built his entire political career on the narrative that only he can protect Israel from its enemies, the same man who spent years designing the doctrine of striking first with lethal force and without apology. Where is Netanyahu right now? He has a war on 5 fronts. He has his nuclear installations under attack. He has his primary ally, Washington, simultaneously managing too many geopolitical variables in a broader world that is consuming increasing amounts of Pentagon attention. And he has an Israeli civilian population that tonight listens to warning sirens and asks out loud whether the shield they were promised truly protects them against missiles traveling at speeds their grandparents could not have imagined. Netanyahu must respond. Not responding is not a viable political option for him. But the question nobody is framing clearly is this: at what point does the Israeli response activate the mutual defense clause that drags the United States into a conflict of a completely different scale? When the board stops being the Middle East and becomes something the world is entirely unprepared for? The answer to that question could arrive sooner than anyone is willing to admit. Because let me tell you something about the escalation logic that is unfolding. Every action generates a reaction of greater intensity. Israel attacks Iranian defense infrastructure. The IRGC activates Hezbollah. Yemen launches hypersonics at Dimona. Israel responds. The axis elevates the response. In this spiral, each cycle is more destructive than the previous one. And at some point in that spiral, someone in the Israeli Security Cabinet is going to look at the map, look at the inventory of available options, and put on the table a category of options that until now has been kept in the darkness of the unspoken. That category does not have a pleasant name. But before we reach that scenario, and there are reasons to believe we are still some distance away, though approaching at a disturbing velocity, there is something I want you to understand about the mechanics of what we are seeing today. The Yemeni communique was absolutely explicit in its frame of reference. This operation, they said, occurs in coincidence with the heroic operations of our brothers in Iran and Iraq. That sentence is key. They are not acting alone. They are not improvising. They are executing within an axis coordination that involves multiple actors, multiple capabilities, and multiple geographies simultaneously. That is exactly what makes this moment different from any previous episode in this conflict. In the October 1973 wars, Israel faced multiple fronts. It survived because coordination among its adversaries had logistical and communications limits that the technology of the era imposed. Today, 50 years later, the real-time coordination capability of an axis extending from Sana'a to Beirut, passing through Baghdad and Tehran, is qualitatively different. Reconnaissance drones share data. Encrypted communication systems operate at speeds unimaginable decades ago. And the technology transfer I mentioned, the Moscow to Tehran chain, guarantees that the most peripheral extreme of the axis has tools that were once reserved exclusively for superpowers. I ask you directly, do you believe the Israeli response against the Axis fronts is going to escalate toward a point of no return this week? Or does the diplomatic board still have margin to absorb what we are seeing? And here comes the operational detail that impacts me most from today's events. The kind of information that conventional journalists mention in passing and then abandon without exploring. Yemen did not only attack Israel. Yemen attacked Dimona. That difference is fundamental, because attacking Dimona sends a message that transcends the logic of immediate physical damage. Dimona is the symbol of the most sacred taboo in Israeli security. It is the secret that is never named in official communiques, that never appears in security cabinet statements, that officially exists in the territory of the unacknowledged. By targeting there, Yemen is saying, we know your secret, we know its location, we have the capability to reach it. And if the entire world demands that Iran not develop nuclear weapons, someone would have to explain why the same arguments do not apply to what exists at Dimona. That is the most powerful political argument of the Yemeni attack, not the material damage still being assessed. It is the unveiling of a hypocrisy that the international order had learned to normalize for decades. When Yemen targets Dimona, it places on the table a question that international institutions have spent 50 years avoiding. And that question will not disappear after today. It will become more urgent with every additional missile that flies in that direction. Now let us talk about the dimension that directly connects everything we are seeing with the specific moment we are living in. The IRGC operates today under a logic that is simultaneously more ideological and more tactically aggressive than in any previous period. The death of the supreme leader on February 28 in a joint operation did not moderate the Iranian security establishment. It radicalized it. The IRGC generals making decisions today are not bureaucrats seeking political legitimacy. They are men formed in the logic of existential resistance, convinced that the survival of the project they defend depends on demonstrating that any aggression carries an unbearable cost. Mojtaba Khamenei, consolidating his position in the new architecture of power, needs the IRGC as much as the IRGC needs him. That alliance of mutual survival between religious leadership and the military apparatus is exactly the type of structure that does not yield under external pressure. It hardens. That is why the analysts who in the weeks following February 28 anticipated a more malleable Iran, more willing to negotiate, more moderate, were projecting their wishes onto a reality that operates with a completely different logic. There was no moderation. There was repositioning. There was activation of all Axis assets. And today, 1 month later, the result of that activation is a hypersonic missile crossing airspace toward Dimona from 2,200 kilometers away from Sana'a. And I ask you, what do you believe the Israeli War Cabinet is discussing at this moment? What options are on the table in Washington? And what is the threshold that, if crossed, transforms this conflict into something the world simply does not have a name for yet? The question that comes after all of this, the question that the coming days will attempt to answer with actions rather than words, is whether the defense systems protecting northern Israel, protecting nuclear sites, protecting critical infrastructure, are capable of absorbing coordinated attacks on 5 simultaneous fronts. Because the Axis is not betting on the single decisive blow. It is betting on exhaustion, on the saturation of defense systems across multiple simultaneous vectors that creates vulnerability windows no shield can fully close. What we experience today is an inflection point. Tomorrow, diplomatic channels may open conversations to contain the escalation. The coming hours may bring Israeli responses that again change conditions on the ground. Washington may decide to apply pressure it has not yet used to deactivate one of the active fronts. All of that is possible. But what is not going to happen, what is already irreversible after today, is that the world returns to speaking of Yemen as a peripheral actor with no real projection capability. What is not going to happen is that Dimona continues to exist in the space of the unmentioned taboo when there are missiles designating it as a target. What is not going to happen is that the axis of resistance is again underestimated in the way it was underestimated for years by Western general staffs. The map of the Middle East is being redrawn in real time, and the ink being used for that redrawing is not diplomatic. It is hypersonic missile propellant. Stay with us. At Professor Jian Wei Explains, we are going to monitor every development of this situation in real time. But before you finish watching this analysis, let me put to you the question that will define everything that comes next. How many fronts can Israel sustain simultaneously before the Samson Doctrine stops being merely a doctrine? The answer to that question could arrive sooner than any of us is willing to admit today. Stay alert. This is only beginning.